A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 49-2, Clandestine Abjuration. Early October, private chambers of the Queen Mother, Pella. 3 weeks of unrelenting pressure and mind-wringing diplomacy, fraught with a severe, suffocating inertia that felt like decades within the mud-choked matrix of the Macedonian Court, had finally concluded. The covenant sat flawlessly finalized. Ptolemy of Elorus had plundered his regency, yet his baseline authority was now explicitly pinned beneath the continuous, demanding, and clinical surveillance of Thebes. The lethal threat engineered by the Illyrians was formally authenticated, and the young princes, including the hypercalibrated mind of Philip, were delivered completely into the palms of the Boeotian state. That night, a monumental silence stagnated across the administrative grid of Pella. Beyond the perimeter of the palace battlements, the great ring of campfires, driven by Pelopidas's heavy hoplite phalanx, flickered like a calculated constellation of surveillance eyes, drawing an absolute boundary line of bronze around the Argead inheritance. Within the vertical geometry of the Queen Mother's private chambers, the air hung fragile and brittle. Eurydice sat perched adjacent to a low bronze brazier, the statuesque mask of dynastic serenity pinned across her features, now systematically fracturing under the volatile pressure of an internal fire. Her daughter Eurydice stood completely rigid at her flank, while the endangered new king, 17-year-old Perdiccas III, paced the length of the limestone floor with the frantic, explosive velocity of a cornered predator testing the bars of its cage. The precise micro-negative second Philip crossed the threshold, Eurydice extended her arm, clamping her fingertips down onto her son's palm with bruising momentum. Her skin was as cold as winter limestone. Philip, her voice cut through the chamber like a razor-thin friction, low and merciless. I have finalized the logistics of your extraction. I would rawly choose to banish your physical frame to the matrix of a Theban hostage, 1,000 times over, rather than audit your systematic castration as a passive prince within this court. If they possess the capacity to slaughter Alexander II amidst the choreography of a festival dance, the trajectory of that blade will mathematically reach the throat of Perdiccas, and its reflection will inevitably converge upon your own flesh. This palace is by no means our home. It constitutes nothing more than a dark pit where vipers execute their coiling sequences. Stability, she classifies it, Perdiccas muttered, halting his forward sequence of strides. His fingers clamped around the hilt of his ceremonial dagger, with enough velocity to turn his knuckles bone wide under the pressure of intense humiliation. The voice of the 17-year-old monarch vibrated with a torrentially repressed guilt, overlaid by a clinical, unvarnished recognition of reality. The boy is being exported for the solitary reason that I am a bankrupt king, an impotent master unable to safeguard the baseline biology of my own house. The immense shadow projected by the regent already encroaches upon this bedrock, with significantly greater reach than my own. Perdiccas executed a total pivot toward the high arched windows, auditing the rhythmic flicker of the Theban campfires. Within the inner circles of Thebes, Philip, your intellect will be handled as a supreme guest under the ultimate military minds of Greece. But calculate my coordinate upon this floor. I draw breath as a pathetic puppet, who must petition that murderer for the basic allowance of the morning air. I entertain a profound envy of your trajectory, brother. You execute an evacuation of the stagnant swamp to enter the ultimate forge engineered for your transformation. I am condemned to remain anchored here, nothing more than an impotent anvil primed to passively absorb the impact of their hammer. Eurydice advanced to occupy the coordinate directly flanking Philip. Her 20-year-old features preserved an undecodable silence, yet her stance radiated a sharp, unyielding severity. Ptolemy and Attalus operate under the absolute delusion that they have plundered a total victory. They assume that by exporting your frame to the Greeks, they have successfully pruned the dangerous branches of this house. Their intelligence lacks the capacity to compute the mathematical truth. By their own palms, they have dropped our most immortal seed deep into the absolute core of the most fertile soil. Philip returned his mother's grip with an iron-like pressure, then extended his hands to stabilize the shaking shoulders of Perdiccas. He met their desperate gazes squarely, his slate-gray pupils anchored to an uncanny, absolute state of detachment, an early maturing intelligence thoroughly tempered amidst the incandescent fire of their brother's funeral pyre. Cease your lamentations, mother. The 14-year-old voice was chillingly flat, executing 0 parameters of youth. I have malted the identity of a child. My intellect has calculated the exact dimensions of the grand strategy I am destined to execute. I entertain 0 fractions of fear regarding this departure for Thebes. To state the unvarnished math of my internal matrix, I'm currently shivering with absolute exhilaration. He aligned his spine, a microscopic adjustment of his musculature that instantly made his physical frame appear significantly older than his winters. I harbor 0 intention to draw breath there as a submissive, compliant guest. I will clinically dissect the structure of their sacred band. I will drain the absolute architecture of Epaminondas's oblique order into my marrow until my brain cells can duplicate its geometry without a solitary error amidst the dark of sleep. I will molt into the authentic commander this house starves to deploy. I will return to stand erect as the absolute shield flanking the spine of King Perdiccas. The architectural framework of his vocabulary carried 0 fractions of cheap, low-yield comfort. It was an absolute clandestine vow. I will personally sketch an impenetrable boundary line around our bloodline, ensuring that 0 assassin's daggers, 0 barbarian incursions, and 0 domestic treasons can ever touch our infrastructure again. At the micro-negative second my boots cross the gates of Pella once more, it is mathematically impossible that I will return as the child who executed the departure. I will return to the soil as the ultimate unbreakable weapon engineered to permanently insulate the future of Macedonia. The heavy, humid air of the Syracusan Court clung to the marble pillars of the Dionysian palace, thick with the scent of sea salt and the metallic, pervasive tang of hidden knives. Inside the peristyle garden, Plato sat upon a simple wooden stool, his back ramrod straight, a stark ink-stained contrast to the gold-gilded decadence surrounding him. Opposite him, Dionysius II lounged upon a divan of Tyrian purple, his eyes glazed with the boredom of a man who owned the horizon but could not command his own appetites. A golden goblet rested precariously in his hand. The wine was rich, dark, and already beginning to dull the edge of his intellect. "Tell me again, Athenian," Dionysius drawled, his voice a languid, practiced affectation of indifference. "How does this geometry of yours, this purity of form, tax the harbors of Sicily? How does it fill the granaries?" Plato did not flinch. He traced a precise line into the sand at his feet with a weathered stylus. "You ask how the sun fills the granaries, king, while complaining that it burns your skin. Geometry does not tax the harbor, it governs the soul that commands the harbor. If the ruler is a chaotic collection of desires, the state is but a reflection of that chaos, a ship navigated by a drunkard." Dionysius stiffened. A shadow of irritation flickered across his face, quickly masked by a predatory, thin-lipped smile. Around them, the court sycophants, men with oiled hair and whispered agendas, stilled their gossiping, their eyes darting between the philosopher and the tyrant. They were waiting for the snap of the whip, the moment the lion tired of the teacher. "Chaos," Dionysius mused, kicking a silk-clad foot toward the sand, erasing Plato's diagram. "I have conquered 3 cities this season, Plato. My walls are thicker than your logic. My spears are sharper than your questions. Is that chaos?" Plato looked at the ruined sand, his expression one of profound, crystalline pity. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He carried with the weight of absolute, unassailable truth. "The spear is a tool, Dionysius. It has no will of its own. It obeys the hand that holds it. But who holds your hand? Is it reason, the steady navigator of the soul? Or is it the screaming child of your own greed, demanding more simply because it has never been taught the definition of enough?" The garden fell into a silence so absolute that the distant crash of the Ionian Sea against the Syracuse cliffs seemed to thunder like a drumbeat. Dionysius sat up, the goblet clattering onto the marble. The mask of the bored autocrat slipped, revealing the terrified, shivering vanity underneath. "You dare? In my own court? You speak to me as if I were a student of the Lyceum, not the master of the Western Mediterranean." "I speak to you as a man who is currently dying," Plato replied, his voice calm, terrifyingly kind. "You are being consumed, king. Not by your enemies, but by the absence of an internal master. You are the richest man in the world, yet you are the most impoverished, for you have not 1 minute of peace that is not bought by fear. You have the empire, yes, But do you have a soul that can bear to be alone in the dark? Dionysius's hand flew to the hilt of his dagger, the gold leaf catching the dying light of the sun. For a heartbeat, the garden held its breath. The guards at the archway shifted, hands tightening on their iron pikes. Plato did not move. He remained seated, his gaze fixed on the tyrant with the unblinking, surgical intensity of a man who had already mastered the art of his own ending. "Kill me," Plato said softly, "and you prove my point that the soul ruled by fear will always strike at the truth it cannot comprehend. Spare me, and you begin the long, agonizing work of becoming a king." Dionysius stared at him, the dagger trembling in his grip. The power, the absolute, crushing weight of his will. It collided with the stillness of the old man, and for the first time in his life, the tyrant found his own hand to be the heavier, more terrifying burden. He did not strike. He could not. The logic of the philosopher was a mirror, and Dionysius, for the first time, had been forced to look into it. Aristotle returned to the cramped storefront he had encountered upon his arrival at the port. He could not recall her name, only that she was a woman of foreign origin, a healer, and an herbalist. The last time they spoke, he had arrogantly offered to instruct her in the healing arts, assuming his philosophical training eclipsed her practical wisdom. Now the shop was a chaotic hive of activity, far removed from the quiet solitude of his previous visit. "What is happening here?" Aristotle muttered, bewildered. There was no one here but her before. The shop was teeming with ailing citizens. The owner was nowhere to be seen, and a harried assistant was struggling to manage the queue. Aristotle stepped inside, catching the man's sleeve. "Where is the owner?" "The lady from foreign lands?" "You mean Master Healer Lysandra?" The assistant replied, distracted. "She's in the tunnels treating the overflow." He gestured toward Ties, a kitchen maid assisting with the triage of the wounded. "Master Healer?" Aristotle repeated, the title hanging awkwardly in the air. "Yes, indeed. She's the best we have." Before Aristotle could process this, Menander arrived at the shop, his presence commanding the space even without a word. The assistant turned to him. "Master Menander, this boy is looking for Lysandra." Menander turned to Aristotle, offering a gaze that was outwardly warm and gentle, masking the keen, vicious intellect that simmered behind his eyes. "So you seek our master healer?" Aristotle's pride surged. He had come to offer her the benefit of his knowledge to correct her methods. But as he looked at Menander, a sudden, sharp clarity halted his tongue. He realized with a jolt of shame how he had prejudged her, viewing her through the narrow, ego-colored lens of his own limited experience. He sealed his lips, his planned lecture dying in his throat. Lysandra walked in behind Menander, her eyes landing on the boy from the week prior. She saw the same arrogant youth, the philosopher in the making who, in his lack of true experience, had instantly categorized her as beneath him, simply because she was a woman and a foreigner. "I am sorry, I forgot your name," Lysandra said, her voice cool and clinical. "You are the son of a physician, if I remember correctly, are you not?" Menander's eyes gleamed as he caught the interaction. He smiled thinly at the boy. "A mere teenager. A pampered son of a doctor playing at being a master of philosophy." "So the son of a doctor?" Menander prompted, his tone mocking. "Since you are so learned, surely you can assist us with these patients." "We are in dire need of professional hands." Aristotle froze. For the first time, his mind, usually a rapid analytical engine, fell silent. He felt hollow, his intellectual vanity stripped away by their direct challenge. He realized with a stinging clarity that he had been shallow, speaking without true thought. "Yes," Aristotle replied, his voice uncharacteristically steady. "I'm the son of a physician. My father served the late King Amyntas III of Macedon." Menander narrowed his eyes. "You are Macedonian? Do you know what is transpiring in your homeland at this very hour?" Aristotle nodded, his expression darkening. "I grew up with the princes in the royal house. It is a time of great peril for my people." Lysandra stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "So you claim to practice medicine? You certainly left an impression last time. You seemed quite eager to lecture me on how I should manage my own shop, did you not?" Aristotle straightened his posture, his chin lifting with the involuntary arrogance of a boy who had spent more time with scrolls than with people. He didn't see a shop full of suffering. He saw a collection of anatomical dysfunctions waiting for a logical intervention. I do not claim to be a veteran of the harbor, Aristotle said, his voice clipped and precise. But I have spent my life absorbing the manuals of Nicomachus. I know the structural divergence between the lung and the liver, and I understand the nature of innate heat as it wanes in the dying. I have assisted in the dissection of cephalopods and mammals. I understand the mechanics of the frame, the geography of the vessels, and the pharmacological logic of herbs. He gestured vaguely toward the patients in the background, his eyes narrowing as he classified them mentally. Each of these cases is merely a series of variables, a corruption of humors or a disruption of internal heat. If one applies the Socratic method to the symptoms, the cause becomes as inevitable as a geometric proof. Then his gaze flickered toward the entrance, remembering the cold, strategic atmosphere of the Macedonian court where he had stood at the periphery, while the princes, including Philip, trained for a future written in blood. I have seen enough of the Macedonian court to understand that a body is like a kingdom, he continued, his tone softening only slightly, though his eyes remained analytical. When the hierarchy of organs or the chain of command is fractured, the entire system collapses. I know the mechanics of power and I know the mechanics of biology. It is simply a matter of restoring the original rational order. He looked at Lysandra, his eyes searching hers for the recognition he expected, missing entirely the look of weary, lived-in wisdom she cast back at him. I did not come here to hinder you. I came because I have a framework that can categorize this chaos. Why treat symptoms blindly when you can classify the source and solve the problem through pure deductive logic? Menander's smile did not reach his eyes. It was a thin, predatory line. Well, since you are the son of a physician, a living medical encyclopedia in the flesh, he remarked, his tone dripping with mock reverence, shall we invite this young gentleman from Pella to see how we truly labor? Lysandra offered a faint, inscrutable smile. By all means, she agreed, her voice smooth and devoid of judgment, though her gaze remained sharp. Perhaps this young philosopher will notice something we have failed to observe. They led Aristotle down into the tunnels. As they descended, the stale, metallic scent of blood and sweat intensified, choking the air. The transition from the world of scrolls and ordered thought to the subterranean reality hit Aristotle with the force of a physical blow. He stopped dead at the entrance to the triage area. This is not a clinic, he thought, his internal monologue stalling as his senses were flooded. This is an anatomy of suffering. His philosophical mind, usually a rapid-fire engine of classification, seized. He had dissected animals in the quiet of his father's study, but here, the subjects were living, weeping, and dying. He saw a man with a shattered femur, the bone protruding through skin that had turned a sickly, necrotic gray. He saw a girl with lungs rattling with infection, her breath a ragged, uneven cadence. Focus, he commanded himself, his knuckles white as he gripped his robes. Do not feel. Categorize. He forced his eyelids to stay wide, suppressing the urge to turn away. He consciously shifted his perspective, viewing the carnage through the clinical, surgical efficiency his father had drilled into him. He wasn't seeing people. He was seeing pathologies, systemic failures, and physical variables. The femur fracture, an improperly stabilized limb leading to secondary inflammation. The lung infection, a classic disruption of the respiratory humors. Is this the rational order you spoke of, boy? Menander whispered in his ear, his voice a low, taunting vibration. Or is the logic of your books failing to account for the chaos of the flesh? Aristotle didn't blink. He felt the cold sweat prickling his spine, but his face remained a mask of practiced detachment. He wants me to falter, Aristotle realized, his mind sharpening into a blade of pure focus. He wants the philosopher to prove that his theories are worthless here. The chaos is only apparent, Aristotle replied, his voice surprisingly steady, though it lacked the bravado of an hour ago. He pointed to a man shivering on a blood-stained pallet. You have treated the wound, but you have ignored the systemic shock. The man's internal heat is dissipating because you haven't managed his blood flow. You are treating the damage, but you are not sustaining the life. He turned to Lysandra, his eyes burning with a new, dangerous intensity. I'm not looking for something you missed. I'm looking for the systemic because that has eluded your practice. Aristotle moved deeper into the tunnel, his boots crunching softly on the grit and dried gore. Every step was a battle against his own physiology. The air here was a thick, stagnant soup of putrefaction, unwashed skin, and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. A sensory assault, far more visceral than the cleanly preserved specimens of his father's study. His stomach lurched violently, a reflexive, primal protest against the miasma. A wave of nausea, cold and acidic, crested in his throat. His vision tunneled for a heartbeat, the flickering torchlight dancing in grotesque, nauseating arcs. Control, he hissed internally, his mind a frantic, desperate architect rebuilding its own walls. I'm the observer. I am the logic. I am not a vessel for this filth. He bit the inside of his cheek until the sharp, metallic taste of his own blood grounded him, forcing the nausea into a corner of his subconscious. He hardened his gaze into a lens of razor-edged focus, stripping the scenes before him of their humanity to protect his sanity. He stopped before a man whose abdomen had been torn open in a dockside brawl. The bowel was exposed, glistening and slick. The intestinal wall is perforated, Aristotle said, his voice coming out as a strained, clinical monotone. He didn't look at the man's face, focusing instead on the geometry of the laceration. The sepsis is localized, but if you do not cauterize the perimeter and induce a purgative to settle the humors, the internal heat will be entirely consumed by the infection within the hour. Lysandra stood to his right, her hands coated in a dark, viscous substance. She watched him, her expression unreadable, waiting to see if he would collapse or continue. You described the what boy, she said, her voice cutting through the thick air. Tell me the how. He's dying in minutes. Your pure logic won't stitch a wound. How do you propose we sustain the heat? Aristotle felt the room tilt. His knees trembled, the strength draining from them, but he forced his core to remain rigid. He saw the tools scattered on a nearby cloth, bronze needles, rough linen thread, a jar of pungent, tar-like salve. Categorize. Prioritize. Execute. We do not stitch it closed immediately, he forced himself to say, his internal narrative working faster than his racing pulse. The trapped air is the enemy. We purge the cavity with a saline mixture, stitch only the outer muscle to secure the integrity, and leave a channel for the humors to drain. If you seal it now, you kill him with his own trapped bile. He reached out, his hands shaking with a tremor he couldn't entirely mask, and pointed to the jar of salve. That. It is an astringent. Apply it after the purge, not before. You are clogging the drain. He stood paralyzed for a second, his mind screaming at him to flee, to run back into the sunlight and the cool, orderly air of the port. He felt his bile rising again, but he clamped his jaw shut. He was standing in the guts of a man, being judged by a woman he had once deemed inferior, in a place that defied every textbook he had ever memorized. I will not fail, he thought, the vow acting as a titanium cage for his crumbling nerves. I will categorize this chaos until it obeys me. He stumbled from the tunnel, the transition to the surface world feeling like a violent eviction from hell. The air inside had been a suffocating shroud, thick with the heavy, sweet rot of gangrene and the metallic sting of blood, a miasma that seemed to crawl over his skin, digging into his pores, desperate to claim him. He reached the threshold of the port, his chest heaving, his lungs burning. Every inhale felt poisoned, as if the invisible specters of the dying, the unseen bacteria, the rot, the black decay, had already colonized his blood. He felt violated by the sight of it. In his father's study, he had dissected fish, cephalopods, and insects, marveling at the elegant clockwork of nature, the vibrant pulse of life even in death. But this was the antithesis of order. This was the grotesque disintegration of the human form, a black, weeping ruin where the divine breath had been extinguished and replaced by a hollow, sickening oblivion. How do they stand it? He wondered, his mind frantic, trying to map the indifference of Lysandra and the predatory calm of Menander. They move through this graveyard as if it were a garden. How do they suppress the revulsion? What is the secret of their detachment? He stepped into the sunlight, the warmth hitting his face like an accusation. His tunic was plastered to his back, damp with a cold, sticky sweat that felt like a layer of filth. The salty, briny breeze of the Aegean hit him, but it brought no solace. It only reminded him of the salt in the blood he had just watched spill. He didn't stop. He pushed himself into a sprint, his legs pumping with a desperate, jerky rhythm. His mind was a frantic machine, spinning at a terrifying speed, attempting to process the horror into data, to transform the grotesque reality into something his intellect could survive. A sudden sharp pressure struck his spine, a jolt of energy so potent it felt like a lightning strike. He buckled, gasping, as Lysandra surged forward, her hand pressed firmly against his back. He felt a searing, forced release of his stagnant, suffocated energy, channeling the pressure down his spine, through his trembling legs, and finally, flushing it into the hard, indifferent earth. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, the world spinning in nauseating gold. "Am surprised by your mental capacity, Aristotle." Lysandra's voice was cool, a sharp contrast to the furnace of his own mind. She stood over him, her face unreadable. "You are a great observer. Your mind is keen, superb even." Menander followed, his shadow long and dark across the harbor stones. He patted Aristotle on the shoulder, the gesture mocking and heavy. "Well done, kiddo. You've got the stomach for the truth, even if you're shaking like a leaf. How about you work with us sometime? These people are always in need of a philosopher's touch." Aristotle knelt in the dust, his hands trembling as he gripped the hem of his tunic. He felt the phantom stench of the tunnel still clinging to him, but as he looked up, he saw the sunlight glinting off the harbor water. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His intellect was still reeling, trying to bridge the gap between his ordered books and the ruinous reality of the flesh. But as he looked at them, at the healer who held life in her blood-stained hands, and the man whose eyes saw through the veil of mortal fear, a slow, fragile smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of terrifying recognition. He had touched the abyss, and for the first time in his life, he knew exactly how much he had left to learn. To be continued in episode 50, Ciphered Skytale of the Argeads, A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Volume 1, Telesias, the War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 15 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.